Welcome back to Broxhammer, everybody, and today we're going to be doing a recap of my first Escalation League game against Dark Angels. So, wanted to do this and put this together for you guys since my game on Monday, and I have to say, I did very well in this game. Partially due to the fact that I just had so many threats that my opponent had to deal with, and his army was rather small and elite. And that, compared with a couple of other factors, which I'll talk about in this video, basically ensured that I was going to be picking up a win against my opponent. Now, this is an opponent I've played against several times, so I kind of knew his army already, and I was used to fighting him, and I kind of knew what he was doing and what his general playstyle was. So that's also really important when playing somebody, is knowing how they're going to play, because then you can kind of adjust your strategy accordingly. So because I've played this guy several times, like I said, I kind of knew what he was going to do, and that really helped when playing against him. So let's go ahead and jump right into this video and talk about, what happened in the game. So, quick overview of what we're going to be doing in this video. We're going to be looking at the mission we played, the secondary objectives, and the army lists. We're going to be doing a turn-by-turn overview with analysis and results. And lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about where do I go from here with my army, what can I do to be better, and what other opponents I might face in upcoming games. So the mission that we rolled was Ascension, and basically the league is random missions, so we don't get to pick the missions before the game. We felt that this was just a fair way to do it, because then people would be, tailoring their lists to certain missions like they do in tournaments. And to be honest with you, we just didn't really want that. We wanted a more casual feel to this tournament, and we wanted to be able to take whatever we wanted, really, without having the added pressure of basically memorizing a certain mission. So we did roll Ascension, which means basically that, advanced move units or advanced position units cannot function the same way. They can't be deployed in no man's land, which was a little bit of a challenge for me because I have Shroud Runners and they get an advanced move, so they weren't able to do that. Now, this mission has the Champion's Honor rule, which basically means the Warlord has objective secured. So that's pretty cool. Having a Warlord with objective secured is always awesome, especially if it's something like a Farseer Skyrunner. And also, the player's Warlord has to be on the battlefield, which isn't really a big deal. Basically, just has to be on the battlefield, or else you have a chance of losing your command point bonus, which is really bad. So you definitely don't want to hold your Warlord in reserve. This mission also has a rule in which the players score 2 victory points if they control the center objective or they destroy at least one enemy unit that was within 6 of the center of the battlefield at the start of the turn. And at the end of the battle, if your Warlord is in range of the center objective, you score 3 victory points, and if you slay your opponent's Warlord, that's also 3 victory points. For the primary objectives, you have the standard control objective control, which is if you control 1 or more objective, you get 4 points. If you control 2 or more objectives, you get 8 points. And of course, this is at the end of your command phase. And if you have more objectives than your opponent, you score 12 points. And the battlefield looked pretty much like this. We were playing on a 4x4 battlefield, which is slightly smaller than your normal game. So normal, tables are about 5 feet by 4 feet. We decided to play by a 4x4 just to make it easier a little bit for us. Because we have such small armies, we felt that it was necessary. So we played on a slightly smaller board, and as you can see here, there are 5 objectives in this mission. For secondary objectives, I chose Behind Enemy Lines, Scout the Enemy, and Scry Futures, which I know some of you might be questioning that and might be, scratching your heads as to why I picked that, because, Scry Futures is something I have ripped on for pretty much since the Codex first came out. I just never really liked the secondary objective. I always thought it was very hard to score on and quite complicated in that you had to basically control the objective and then you had to use the psychic action on it. and no enemy unit could be on it. You know, it has a lot of conditions, so I just have never really liked it. But my opponent's army was very small, had very low amount of models in it, being, you know, Dark Angels, having jet bikes and Terminators. I figured this would be a chance to use this in a way that would be effective. Also, I was really afraid that my opponent's Librarian was going to shut down Warp Ritual really badly. Because, yeah, basically I'll talk about that when I talk about his army list. But his Librarian had a couple of abilities that made him very durable and very, you know, to be honest with you, effective at shutting down psychic powers. So, quick recap of what Behind Enemy Lines is. Behind Enemy Lines is you score 3 victory points at the end of your turn if you have a unit in your enemy's deployment zone. If you have 2 units in your enemy's deployment zone, you score 4 victory points. Aircraft units, of course, are excluded from this as well. And again, because I have so many fast units in my army, I have swift strikes, it's really easy for me to get into the enemy's deployment zone. And because my opponent has, a low number of models, I figured this would be a perfect objective. And it was. I scored very well on this during the game. I also took Scout the Enemy, which might seem weird as I have no Rangers, but again, in low point games like this, when your opponent really doesn't have many tools to deal with things like Vipers, any model can score on Scout the Enemy, even Vipers. And yes, it does complete in your command phase, at the end of your command phase, but if you can get a Viper in the enemy's deployment zone on a flank and you can just kind of score this turn after turn, it's a very good way of generating a lot of victory points. Especially if you're ahead in the game, and this is exactly what ended up happening. My Vipers were able to score this pretty effectively. Now, Scry Futures was the one that I really honestly took just because I really had no better options. And I thought this one might be good. So, well, long story short, I didn't score well on it at all. He still shut it down with his Librarian pretty much during the first couple turns of the game. So, wasn't able to really get that going, but the theory was sound. Okay? The theory was sound. Although, you know, it's funny how the game ended up shaking out. I would have done much better with Warp Ritual. I actually would have scored 1 more victory point with Warp Ritual based on what happened in the game than I would on this objective. So, unfortunately, ended up not working out. But, you know, things happen, I guess. You know, mistakes are usually made. So, no worries there. Okay, for the Dark Angel secondary objectives, he chose the basic ones that most Dark Angels players choose, to be honest. Oaths of Moment, Stubborn Defiance, and Codex Warfare. Oaths of Moment basically gives you victory points for these different conditions that you meet during the battle. And you get 1 victory point each time you kill a character, vehicle, or monster, which I really didn't have many of except for the Vipers and my Farseer. So there's that. Oath of Honor, you score 1 victory point for every unit that didn't fail a morale test during a battle round. So basically, if you don't fail any morale tests, you score a victory point every battle round that you don't fail one. And Oath of Duty, you score 2 victory points if a unit from your army is wholly within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield, which is also pretty powerful, right? Now, the only thing is, it happens at the end of the battle round. So if you go first, your opponent actually has a chance of stopping this, but in this game, my opponent went second, so this was a really good pickup. He also took Stubborn Defiance. You basically choose an objective outside your deployment zone and a Dark Angels unit with objective secured, which, by the way, pretty much all Dark Angel Terminator Deathwing units have objective secured. They basically score a number of victory points for controlling that objective. So in turn 1, if you control it, you get 1 victory point. Turn 2, you get 2 victory points. Turn 3, you get 3 victory points, etc., etc. This is a staple secondary objective for larger games with Dark Angels. However, I have to say it just didn't really work out for him in this game because he only had 1 unit of Terminators and they weren't buffed by an Apothecary or anything like that, so they were a little less durable than usual. And I have to say his choice in the objective he chose for this one wasn't a good one. He chose the one in the very center of the battlefield, which I understand why you would want to combine that with Oaths of Moment It's a very good strategy and one that's very good in 2,000 point games because, again, you have the support of the Apothecary, you have other support for your Terminators that make them very tough. You know, usually we play with a piece of terrain on the center of the battlefield, basically a piece of light cover or something like that, which I happen to ignore because of my faction bonus, Masterful Shots. But yeah, it just didn't really work out for him because of that fact. Because of the fact that he only had 1 unit of 5 and it just wasn't enough to hold out for the whole game. And lastly, he had Codex Warfare, which, to be honest with you, is a fantastic objective, again, for 2,000 point games, because it relies on destroying more units with your army. Again, he didn't have a lot of units that could really shoot. He only had his bikes and attack bikes. And furthermore, I didn't really have that many units because, you know, even though I had a lot more units than he did, I still didn't have the amount needed to generate a lot of points on this. And I think this was a mistake to take this as well. I think he should have taken something else, tried to go for something else a little bit, because to be honest with you guys, Codex Warfare is really good in higher point games. It's not so great in small games. And I think one of the main mistakes my opponent made in this game was choosing objectives that were good for him in 2,000 points, but not factoring in that we're now playing a 500 point game. Your secondary objectives are not going to be as good unless you table me. So unless you table me, you're not going to be scoring a lot of points on these objectives. Well, at least some of them, right? Especially Codex Warfare. So I think that was a mistake. He did score something on this, but I don't think it was much. And as a result, I think his performance really suffered because of that. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the army lists. So starting off with his army list, he had a Chief Librarian and Terminator armor, of course, Deathwing. He has the Might of Heroes, Veil of Time, and Null Zone psychic powers. Really, the only one that helped him was Might of Heroes once in the beginning of the game, but to be honest with you, it didn't really help him beyond that. Null Zone and Veil of Time are very effective as well, but he just wasn't able to get those off. He also has the Neural Shroud, which is basically a +1 to psychic denial tests, which is why I kind of feared using Warp Ritual in this game as a secondary objective. And it also extends the range of the psychic hood to 24 inches, which is really good. And I think it does something else too. I'm not remembering what it does right now, but I think it might do something else as well. And he also had the Watched Warlord trait, which basically gives you a once a game auto denial on a psychic power. And again, this was very frustrating for me, especially for my secondary objective, Scry Futures. For his fast attack, he basically took the minimum amount needed to fill it out so that he could, have his compulsory choices. He had 3 bikes with 2 plasma guns in there. 1 attack bike had a heavy bolter. And then he had 2 attack bikes with multi-meltas. For his elites, he had 5 Terminators with the Thunderhammer and Storm Shield coming in at 165, and that's basically it. That was his army. Very small army. He only had a couple models in it. And, even on a 4x4 board, when you're fielding this few models, you're not going to have a lot of board presence. And I think that's exactly one of the things that really cost him in this game as well, was just not having board presence where he needed it in the beginning of the game. And yeah, basically not being able to really respond after a couple of units died. For my army, I had a Farseer Skyrunner with Guide and Doom. I really considered taking Will of Azurian, and I think that probably would have been the better pick overall, but I was mostly using my Farseer to try to score on Scry Futures this game. Rarely was I using any psychic powers for anything else. I did, I think, use a command point once to use Unparalleled Mastery, basically to allow me to use an action as well as a psychic power. I think I used Guide, in fact, on my Dire Avengers one time. I think that was what happened. My Fire Dragons were basically, they didn't have an Exarch power, let's put it that way. Usually I like to put Blazing Fury on them, but the Exarch only had a Fire Pike because I had extra points. And I also had 5 Dire Avengers with the Exarch having the dual Shuriken Catapults. I had 3 Shroud Runners and 2 Vipers with Scatter Lasers, and these guys were really good. I think these guys were actually the MVP of the game, the Vipers, because they scored so many points. they basically maxed out 2 objectives on their own. So yeah, Vipers are very good in small point games, and I learned that honestly, they're almost unstoppable if your opponent doesn't have the tools to put them down. And my opponent did have 2 attack bikes with multi-meltas that could have done something, but because I was able to maneuver my Vipers into a position to essentially isolate one of them, partially because he made a misplay as well, I was able to, basically shield my Vipers from harm for the most part. Okay, so this is what deployment looked like. Basically, I got the left side of the board, and I ended up winning the role to go first. So I got the first turn. I set up my Shroud Runners on the top left side. Behind the Shroud Runners is my Farseer. This was probably my first mistake. And I wish I had deployed the Farseer on the other side of the battlefield with the Vipers. I probably shouldn't have deployed him on this side just because of the fact that I ended up having a much harder time controlling the left side of the board, or his left side, because of all the bikes that he deployed over on his top right. But yeah, basically, probably should have deployed that Farseer on the other side. I had 5 Dire Avengers right next to the Shroud Runners. They were basically just going to go onto that objective eventually and maybe just hide behind terrain in the beginning of the game, just because I didn't want to get caught out by his bikes. His bikes move very fast. And if I just parked myself on that objective, my Dire Avengers would have died in 1 turn. Basically, I've played him a few times, and I know that he really likes to use the stratagem that allowed them to move faster. And basically what he does is he just rolls around a flank, rolls around the side of a piece of terrain, and just lights up whatever's on the other side. So I didn't want to get caught by that, but I did deploy them there to give him the impression that that's what I was doing. And I know that's a little bit of an Eldar mind game or trick or whatever. I didn't actually plan on putting the Dire Avengers on the objective right away, but I just wanted to make sure that he had at least 1 unit of bikes on that other side ready to attack if, he needed to. So he did deploy his bikes in, kind of, I don't want to say retaliation to what the Dire Avengers were doing, but, in relation to where the Dire Avengers were placed. And on my bottom left, I have 2 Vipers with the scatter lasers. Now, I deployed these as a redeployment. So basically, I phantasmed these. Originally, I had basically everything on one side of the battlefield. And my opponent, knowing that I had phantasm, decided to move at least one of his attack bikes to the other side of the battlefield. And while I don't think this is bad in theory, because I have swift strikes and am able to advance and shoot my heavy weapons at full ballistic skill with the Vipers, I think this is what caught him off guard, because he was expecting that attack bike to live, and he was also expecting that, okay, if my opponent tries to get around that piece of terrain, he's not going to have the movement required to shoot my attack bike and kill it. And I told him at the beginning of the game that I actually did have the movement to do this if I wanted to. I told him I had a 22-inch threat range, and yeah, he still placed his attack bike there. So I redeployed over there on the other side of the battlefield. I asked him if he, wanted to spend any command points to do any kind of redeployments, but he also has a Warlord trait and a relic, so he could not spend the 2 command points needed to move that attack bike. So he ended up staying there and passed turn to me. So my first turn was about to begin. Okay, so my first turn begins, and the first thing I'm doing is I am moving my Vipers onto that objective on the bottom right side of the battlefield. So I moved 1 Viper onto the objective, and I moved the other Viper slightly outside of it. And basically my goal was this. I was going to light up that attack bike, and I was going to make sure that that attack bike died. Because if I made sure that attack bike died, he was going to have much less in his arsenal to be able to kill my Vipers, which was the goal. And also the other attack bike and the regular bikes that had a lot of threat against my Vipers that could very easily kill them were on the other side of the battlefield and weren't in a position to retaliate. On the top side of my battlefield side, so basically the top left, my Shroud Runners moved behind that piece of terrain. They did do a battle focus move back into it. Basically, I wanted to take shots at the Terminators a little bit, pepper them down, maybe do a couple wounds. He didn't have an apothecary, so I wasn't worried about him resurrecting models or anything like that. And with the Strands of Fate dice, I was able to actually end up killing one Terminator, which, to be honest with you, when I killed that one Terminator, I thought to myself, man, maybe it's going to be a little bit easier to kill these guys than I originally thought with scatter lasers. And again, I was wounding on 4s because of the transhuman, but I was hitting on 2+, and he wasn't getting any light cover bonuses. So basically, even my long rifles were able to deal mortal wounds. Now, I know that probably wouldn't have mattered anyway because he had storm shields with a 1+, armor save. But every one he rolled was a failed save. So if I just pumped enough shots into him, I felt like I could definitely deal with his Terminators. And I was keeping my Dire Avengers in a position as well behind the terrain to make sure that they were safe so that they survived to be able to deal damage to the Terminators as well. Now, I kind of knew he was going to do this, but I basically moved my Farseer up on the objective and I declared that I was going to use the Scry Futures action. I rolled my Psyche test, and then he just basically told me that he was going to use his special Warlord trait, the Watched, to deny it. So I don't know if this was the right move, to be honest with you, in the first turn, but then I thought about it a little bit and thought to myself, it is probably the better move for him to do that right off the bat, just in case he does lose his Librarian or, he moves into a position later to deny psychic powers with a +1. So he did deny it. That was a good move. And basically, I just battle focused back with the Farseer after that to make sure that I was behind enough of, a piece of terrain to be safe from the bikes, which honestly had the threat range if I stayed on the objective to be able to attack me. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention, he did place his Stubborn Defiance marker on the center objective. So you see where his Terminators are positioned in the middle of his side of the battlefield? Well, basically, he wanted to march his Terminators to the middle of the battlefield, which I think was a huge mistake. I think he should have picked the one that the Vipers are currently on, because that would have been much safer for his Terminators to sit on and just be behind obscuring terrain and just be really safe. Also, if he had his Terminators there, I would not have been able to move my Vipers there without fear of his Terminators being able to charge in. Which, again, huge mistake, right? Letting my Vipers just basically get into his deployment zone and wreak havoc, and putting his Terminators onto the center objective instead, where I could just shoot him to bits, wasn't a great idea in the beginning of the game. Alrighty, so that was my turn 1. I basically was able to successfully get my Farseer behind obscuring terrain over there. My Dire Avengers were behind it, as well as my Shroud Runners. I know just based on the picture, it looks like maybe he could get some line of sight, but I had them really squeezed in, so he wasn't able to do that. Now, what he did during his first turn was basically just move his single attack bike way over to be able to get line of sight on my Vipers, to shoot them, of course. He moved his regular bikes up a little bit, staying on the objective, making sure he still had that objective under control, but being in a position to where if I moved on my objective, he would be able to counterattack, which was a good move. I actually agree that he should have done this and not just, go forward and basically just go forward to his own death with his bikes. He did need his bikes for the late game, and he knew that. And also, he moved up his Terminators and advanced them. He wasn't able to get a great advance, but he was able to advance to the point where, he was going to guaranteed get on the objective in the center of the battlefield in turn 2. Now, here's where I think my opponent started to get a little bit tilted with things, because his attack bike shot, he had a command point for a reroll, and when he shot his multi-meltas at my Viper that was on the objective, he thought he was going to kill it. However, he didn't. Now, basically what happened here was that as soon as he targeted my Viper with an attack, I used the lightning fast reflexes stratagem to give him a -1 to hit. Now, this may not seem like a lot, but hitting on 3s with a command reroll versus 4s is actually kind of a big deal, and I knew it could have possibly saved my Viper from being destroyed. And I figured my Viper would take some damage, to be honest with you guys, but it just didn't. So basically what happened is he only ended up hitting once. He tried to command reroll the hit, but he missed again. And then on the wound roll, he actually rolled a 2. And he considered using another command reroll for it, but I reminded him that you can only use one command reroll per phase. So basically what that meant was he just did nothing. And my opponent was very upset at this. He was complaining that this was a terrible roll. He should have killed that Viper, etc., etc. And to be honest with you, to be fair, yes, there was a decent chance that the Viper would have died, right? He did manage to get the bike within 12 inches. I know it doesn't seem like it based on the picture, but he was actually within 12 inches of the Viper to shoot. So that means he was getting additional damage. And, multi-meltas have 2 shots apiece, so they're pretty good. And then he does also have a twin bolter on there, which was getting 4 shots. And I think a bolt gun as well, if I'm not mistaken. But, he had a decent amount of firepower on that thing. And basically he was arguing that he should have killed it. And math, the math messed him up and whatever. And, I get it. I haven't done the exact math on whether or not a multi-melta is on average going to kill a Viper when I use lightning fast reflexes. But, to be honest with you, I just didn't think it was a guarantee. I have to admit, just being an Eldar player, just knowing, math very well with things like Guide, things like Doom, and just being able to precisely calculate the average damage of anti-tank units like fire dragons and stuff, I just wasn't convinced that a multi-melta was going to guaranteed kill a Viper every single turn. Especially if I use lightning fast reflexes, you really shouldn't rely on a single multi-melta to be able to kill a Viper. Now, I do think in larger units, like if he had 2 attack bikes firing at that Viper, I absolutely think he should have killed it, right? Average rolls, average dice, those 2 multi-meltas are going to destroy that Viper, without a doubt. Even with lightning fast reflexes, right? He should have killed it. But because he only had 1, and because he didn't have the other attack bike available to shoot because I killed it, I really honestly told him, maybe you should have done some damage to it. I just don't think you would have killed it, basically. So, I get it. He disagreed with it, whatever. We moved on. He was a little tilted by it, though, and he was basically saying, well, I lost. And whenever a player does that, you kind of take a step back a little bit, and you're like, oh, it's going to be one of those games, right? When they're kind of already calling it on their first turn, you know that it's a little bit sus about how much fun you're going to have, basically. But hey, whatever, I've played this guy many times. We've had pretty close games in the past. He's beaten me a couple times too, especially at bigger points when you can have, apothecaries healing your stuff and all that. So we've had some good games, but this just wasn't one of them. This was kind of a blowout. Now, the reason why it was, again, I think it's partially due to the fact that he did get tilted at the end. I think it would have been closer if he hadn't have tilted this bad. But basically, yeah, he missed with his multi-melta, and he just basically had to pass turn. He did also try to pass a psychic test to make his unit tougher, but I was able to return the favor on him and deny it with my Farseer. So in my turn 2, I basically realized that if I allowed his Terminator unit to basically remain as a full squad, getting on that objective, they were going to be kind of hard to deal with in the late game, especially if his bikes decided to swing around and start attacking my flanks. So what I did was I brought in my fire dragons from reserve, which I could do now because it was turn 2, and I went ahead and dropped them in the terrain on the bottom right side of the board. And I swung one of my Vipers into the enemy deployment zone so I could basically score 4 points on behind enemy lines. And with that Viper, I also performed the scout the enemy action. So I wasn't going to be able to shoot with that Viper, but the fire dragons were more than able to take out that attack bike by themselves. So the Viper that was on the objective really didn't do anything. I was hoping that maybe if the fire dragons left the bike at like 1 wound or something by some chance, that the Viper would be there just to finish it off, but didn't happen, so I didn't end up shooting that Viper. In the middle of the board, my Shroud Runners moved to the centerpiece of terrain, and my Dire Avengers peeked out of that piece of obscuring terrain on the top left side of the board, and they shot at the Terminators. So here's the thing. I was actually not able to get off more than a guide on my Farseer. My Farseer basically went over to that other objective and tried to use, well, Scry Futures, right? However, it was denied by the Librarian, which was now within 24 inches of pretty much all the objectives. So because I wasn't able to get that off, I just spent a command point to basically cast another Psychic Power, and I went ahead and just cast Guide on the Dire Avengers. So that actually did go off. He wasn't able to deny that, at least. So that was a benefit. And I just shot him, basically. So my Shroud Runners went ahead and shot at his Terminators, and the Dire Avengers shot at the Terminators as well. And between the two units, I was actually able to kill 2 of them. So, again, pretty decent. I mean, you know, in a real 2,000 point Dark Angels list, I wouldn't have been able to even kill 2 Terminators probably, because they have that 6+ feel no pain from the medic or apothecary or whatever. So I wouldn't have even been able to do that, to be honest, but I was able to do it in this case. Because for one, he failed to get off that Psychic Power to increase his unit's toughness, and 2, he just didn't have the other support characters that are able to make Deathwing Terminators so tough. So I was able to kill 2 of those, able to kill the attack bike, and from here, he basically had no more tools to deal with everything in my army. Okay, so his turn 2 comes along. And I think this is where he made another mistake, because he could have continued to score on primary objective points if he had just left his bikes on his objective in his deployment zone. However, I think by this time he just wanted to kill stuff. Let me just put it that way. So he moved his bikes forward within range of the Fire Dragons, and he basically shot at the Fire Dragons. And I asked him why he did this later on and why he didn't just stay on the objective. And he basically told me that he didn't want the Fire Dragons sniping his Librarian or shooting at his Terminators. He knew that they had a decent range, and because I could basically advance and move 7 inches and still shoot with the Fire Dragons and then battle focus on top of that, he really didn't want them to be alive anymore. So that's why he made that decision. In hindsight, he told me he probably should have just tried to go for the Viper and stayed on the objective, and maybe his bolters wouldn't have been in range, but he could have at least maybe gotten a couple wounds with the heavy bolter, which is possible. Vipers have toughness 5, so they're not that tough, and a heavy bolter could, you know, possibly put a few wounds on it on average rolls. He also moved the Librarian and the rest of his Terminators up onto the objective in the center, and was able to just basically score some points on that. Which in this mission, if you control the center objective at the end of your turn, you get 2 victory points for that. So he did get 2 victory points for that. Pretty good there. And I think he also scored 1 point on something else. I can't exactly remember what it was. But yeah, and that was basically his turn 2. Now, here's the thing. When he shot at the Fire Dragons, he was expecting to do a lot of damage to them and possibly kill them. But he just wasn't able to do it. Now, I think the reason why is because I actually had a Strands dice for a save. So when he shot one of his plasma guns, it went through and it probably would have killed the Fire Dragon, but I made sure that that was saved with the Strands of Fate dice. So I only ended up losing 2 Fire Dragons. He was also shooting into dense cover, which was a -1 to hit. So again, you know, this was one of those scenarios where the Fire Dragons are normally a very squishy target, but because he's basically using, you know, a unit that is not really that great at shooting outside of 12 inches, and because I'm in light cover and because, you know, I have a Strands dice to save, I was actually able to save more Fire Dragons than would be normally the case. And when I rolled leadership on them, I passed. You know, I mean, I only lost 2 models, so there wasn't a great chance I was going to fail that anyway. But again, this was one of those scenarios where he was actually expecting to kill them, and when he didn't, I feel like he kind of tilted a little bit more after that. And again, this isn't to, kind of ridicule anybody. We've all had those games where we shoot at something we expect to die and it doesn't because of numerous different things, right? I'm sure a lot of us as Eldar players have had that scenario where we add up the damage and we should kill a unit, but then because of a stratagem or something else that's going on in the battle, we don't quite kill that unit. Maybe they pop transhuman or something like that and we just don't get the kill on it. That's happened to all of us, right? So, I don't hold it against them at all to make that decision. That was, again, I wouldn't have made that choice. I would have just played for the objectives at that point, seeing as he's already lost 2 of his attack bikes, and he really only has 1 unit that can score reliably, right, on his home objective now, which is the bikes. But I could also see the argument for him wanting to kill the fire dragons. Again, he does want to kill something, and he knows he's probably going to lose this game just because he's at this point very behind in the first couple of turns, and he just wants to kill a few, models and maybe eliminate the unit. And because fire dragons are kind of unique for Eldar units, they have toughness 4, so they're a little bit more resilient to bolter fire. This is something he really didn't account for. So he ended up killing less than he thought, and he had to basically end his turn there. So my turn 3, and I move my Shroud Runners into the ruin on the bottom left. I plan to use a stratagem that allows outcast units to battle focus at full speed when they're in terrain. I also moved my Dire Avengers slightly out. I also wanted to battle focus them back behind terrain as well. My Farseer, I kind of made a movement mistake on him, and I didn't quite have the range to get to that objective up there, and also be able to capture the objective to score on Scry Futures. So unfortunately, I just basically had to advance to full speed and then battle focus onto the objective so I could use it the next turn, possibly. Then I moved the Viper on the right side of the battlefield slightly back, a little more at a safe distance so that I wouldn't be in, rapid fire range of bolters if he chose to move his bikes a little bit back. And it basically just performed scout the enemy. The Viper on the objective, now having line of sight to the bikes, opened fire on them and actually did some significant damage and actually killed one of them. Now, the Dire Avengers and the Shroud Runners opened fire on the last Terminators, and, again, this was one of those scenarios. He was in cover, he thought he had a good chance of surviving, but my whole army ignores light cover. And because the Farseer couldn't quite perform the Scry Futures action, I was able to actually get Doom off on the Terminator unit. So that really helped me be able to finish off those last 2 Terminators. And on the right side of the battlefield, my Fire Dragons moved forward, advanced. I got a great advance roll, and I was actually able to put some shots into the Librarian, who was on the center objective. And of course, now the Librarian is all alone. There are no friendly units within 3 inches, so basically can't look out, sir. And my Fire Dragons took 3 shots at him. I hit twice. I wounded once with the Exarch, and that's all it took. Basically, he failed his invul save, and my Exarch took him out with a roll of a 5 on 1d6 plus 4. And because remember, I do have a fire pike on my Exarch, he does a little bit more damage. And this was something that, again, it made my opponent a little bit salty, I have to admit. He was pretty mad at that. I remember him saying that, basically that Eldar were bullshit at this point, and I can't make a single save to save my life. Which, it's a 50-50 chance, right? You have a 4+ invul, you have a 50-50 chance of making it. You could have command re-rolled it. I think he actually did, and I think he still failed, if I'm not mistaken. I think he did command re-roll it now that I think about it. So, yeah, there was a good chance you would make that. But, again, it's not guaranteed, right? I don't know. Anyway, it was probably really unlucky. I didn't actually expect to kill the Librarian, to be honest. I just thought, you know what? I'm just going to go for it. There's a pretty decent chance that I can hit and wound with at least 1 Fire Dragon and possibly kill him, right? So that was kind of unlucky that he failed 2 rolls in a row with the reroll, but it happens, right? I've had games where I've failed psychic test after psychic test, gotten nothing off, and, basically lost by a large margin. I've had games like that. You know, I don't take them personally. I just think it's part of the game. It's a dice game. Sometimes you roll bad, and sometimes you roll really good and you have a really good game. It just depends, right? It's all the luck of the dice most of the time. Now, obviously there are things that you can do to increase your odds, which is what we're all trying to do in the game, right? Make sure our odds are the best possible. So that's what he did do. He did use the command reroll. It just didn't work out. That's all. So his librarian died. At this point, he was basically just had his attack bike and his 2 bikes in the unit left. And come his turn, he told me, well, he was going to make sure that those fire dragons died, and he did. The fire dragons were destroyed. So he moved back between the heavy bolter and the normal, well, basically the 2 plasma guns that were left in the unit, plus the bolters. He was able to easily kill the fire dragons. Now, he did actually ironically roll decently on this. I didn't have a strands dice for a save or anything like that for him, so they did go down pretty easily. And that was his turn 3, essentially. So moved his bikes back on the objective, which I think was a smart move. At this point, he was just kind of trying to pad his loss as much as possible by getting extra victory points. The victory points that he could get, and moved back on that objective. Now, at this point in the game, I really had no plans or any kind of machinations to try to kill his bikes. I really just didn't care at this point. I wanted to make sure that I scored my victory points. So on my turn 4, that's exactly what I did. I just moved another Viper from that objective over to his deployment zone so I could max out behind enemy lines. I did scout the enemy as usual. My Farseer moved to the middle of the board so I could use Scry actions, or I keep saying Scry actions, but Scry Futures psychic action. My Shroud Runners also moved to the middle of the board because I didn't want to give him a free kill, because what he could have done, by the way, if I had left my Farseer alone, is he could have basically easily just zipped his bikes around the corner and shot 2 overcharged plasma guns at him. And all the extra bolters and the heavy bolter, it would have killed my Farseer without a doubt. So I made sure to move up my Shroud Runners with them so that they could take the hits. And, you know, in cover, they're pretty durable. So I figured they would survive. And this made my opponent not even basically want to try to do that. And he just basically sat on his objective during his turn 4. He said, okay, I passed turn. I'm going to sit on my objective. I'm going to score my victory points. Go ahead. And on my turn 5, it was basically just me moving my models. He was kind of checked out at this point. He was counting up his victory points, you know, texting, doing other stuff. And I just moved my Farseer over to the last objective, scored another 3 points on Scry Futures, which made it 6 in total, which isn't really a lot. I only used the action twice in the game, which was terrible. But, you know, scored again on it. And that truly brought us to the end of the game. So the end of the game looked like he had 2 bikes basically left on his objective. I did shoot him a couple times just to roll some dice. It wasn't really a big deal. I did shoot him a couple times and eliminate one of his bikes during one of those turns, but again, didn't matter. He didn't fail a morale test or anything like that, so wasn't really a big deal. Shroud Runners were in the center of the board. I had my Farseer still alive, and I controlled several objectives on the battlefield. So as far as the points that I scored, I was able to max out my primaries, not because Eldar are good at primaries, but because he really didn't have anything to contest me on several objectives throughout the game. I was scoring 12 points per turn, basically, maxing out that pretty quickly. On my secondary objectives, I was able to max out behind enemy lines and scout the enemy, which is, again, rare. I usually do not max these out. I get a lot of points on them, but I don't usually max them like this. So this was kind of one of those scenarios where, again, it was kind of a runaway. He didn't have a lot to stop me, so I was able to max those out easily. Scry Futures, on the other hand, and to his credit, he did have a plan to stop my psychic secondaries, and he did. His librarian was pretty good at it. Being able to auto-deny one of them one turn is huge, and then basically being able to deny another one later in the game, as well as just me making a mistake and not moving correctly, also cost me there. I scored 10 points for having everything fully painted and based, which everybody has. It's basically a give me. So my total points was 91. I basically missed 6 points on Scry, but scored maxed on everything else, which, by the way, is extremely good. And it's mostly because, to be honest, it was a very one-sided game for most of the turns. When we look at his score, he scored 14 on primary objectives. He scored 8 on secondary objectives. So 7 of that was in Oath of the Moment, which was by far the best one for him, I think. I think that one's still a pretty good one. He lost really bad and still scored high on it. Stubborn Defiance, I think he chose the wrong objective for this. He chose the middle objective, which was very exposed to my army. He should have picked the one on the left side of the board. So that would be his left. It would actually be the bottom side if you're looking at it on this video. He should have chosen that objective. It was just much easier to control, and his Terminators would have been much safer. I would have had a much harder time stopping this, and I think he would have scored a lot higher in the game. Codex Warfare was another one where his army just was not built to do range damage, and it showed. You know, the units that could really score on it were the attack bikes, and they died very quickly, and he was unable to capitalize on that Devastator doctrine at all, and the only point he scored was actually from the tactical doctrine from killing the fire dragons, which was a good play, right? He knew he was going to kill them, he knew he had the range and everything, so that was a good play, switching to that doctrine and blowing those fire dragons out of the water. So, good move on that. Unfortunately, it was only 1 victory point. So that left him with a total of 32 victory points in all. So the mistakes my opponent made that cost him the game, I do want to talk about this and address this a little bit, because this is a player that is not, he's not a bad player. He just is used to higher point games. And I think one of his main issues was that he transferred everything that was working well for him at 2,000 points, and he basically just tried to scale that down to 500, and it just did not work out. And also, in addition to this, he left one of the attack bikes isolated, and one was pretty badly deployed. So again, in larger point games, this wouldn't be a big deal because the attack bikes would be around other units and they would possibly be behind obscuring terrain. So they'd be very hard to kill. But because one of them was badly positioned, I was able to take advantage of that with swift strikes and kill that bike very quickly. The Stubborn Defiance objective, like I said a couple times during this video, was also badly positioned in my opinion. He should have chosen the objective that was closer to his deployment zone instead of the middle of the board where he was very exposed. And again, this isn't a 10-man Terminator unit, right? A 10-man Terminator unit with a apothecary, a chief apothecary and support, is going to be able to survive. A 5-man unit with no support, barely any support, is not going to be able to survive like the 10-man can with support. As for Codex Warfare, again, I don't think his 500-point army is set up for it. If he used more attack bikes and if he had more, bike units, Ravenwing is actually quite powerful. They can put out a lot of damage. Problem is, if you're not really investing too much in bikes and you're investing more in Terminators, you're not going to have a lot of range firepower, especially if your units that can score on this are dead within the first couple of turns. And lastly, kind of on a more personal level, a human being level, I think because of the fact that he was so tilted and he went really strongly after the fire dragons after his turn, so basically during his turn 2, when he should have stayed on the objective with his bikes, I think that also cost him. The fire dragons, they killed the attack bike. They weren't really in range to kill much else, except of course I did roll lucky on their, advance roll and was able to get some shots on his librarian, which again, a thing of luck, right? Librarian should not have died to the Exarch, probably. He had a 75% chance of survival, and he failed it. So, that was unlucky, right? Let's all just admit that. That was an unlucky thing. But, it happens in games, and I think you should always stay focused on what you're trying to do in a battle instead of, kind of focusing on what went wrong, And I think that's one of the things that holds a lot of players back in games where they're doing poorly in the first couple of turns, is they focus on everything that's going wrong and not what they can do to remedy the situation or what they can do right? They lose focus. And I think that's something he did. Unfortunately, moving his bikes like that was a very unneeded maneuver. Didn't need to do it, but he did it anyway because, he wanted to kill something very badly. So unfortunately for him, he didn't have a very good game this time, but I think he will have better games in the future when he gets closer to the amount of points that he's comfortable with. In 750 and 1,000 points, I think he's going to have much more tools to be able to score on those objectives that he's used to scoring on. So things like Codex Warfare, of course, and Stubborn Defiance, he's going to have a lot more tools to be able to score on those effectively. So as for me, I know that my next 2 games will be at 500 points, and my next opponent is going to be Imperial Guard, which this is an Imperial Guard player I've played before. Again, I do know his playstyle. I do know generally what he takes, but apparently he's going to be taking more tanks. He's bringing a lot of Sentinels, and he's also bringing a Leman Russ battle tank in 500 points. So again, that's going to be a hurdle to get over. I know that my Fire Dragons can take it out, but not without return damage, right? Because if I do kill it, it is going to be able to shoot back at me. So I do have to be careful about that. So that's going to be tricky. I'm kind of still trying to figure out how to deal with the Imperial Guard in the correct way. Also, I need a better plan for Scry Futures if it comes up again. So if my opponent has a way to deal with Warp Ritual, I need to be better at either scoring on Scry Futures, or I just need a better plan for it in general. Because, you know, basically if I don't go with Warp Ritual, and those other 2 objectives are harder to score on, let's say behind enemy lines and scout the enemy aren't as available, it's going to be tough to score secondary objective points. And that's something that I think my army could be weak in if I lose the Vipers or if I lose something very early in the game. So in conclusion, I think honestly the game went really well for me, right? A couple of mistakes that I made with regards to the Scry Futures, you know, and the positioning of that. And for my opponent, a key bad roll, which was the Multi-Melta fail, set me up for a really high scoring game. So again, the Multi-Melta probably shouldn't have killed the Viper on average rolls. But yeah, I mean, I can't say that it didn't hurt him, right? Because if he had gotten lucky and killed that Viper, I think, yeah, it would have been a much different game. I think I would have had a lot less tools to be able to deal with them. Now, I still think I probably would have ended up winning, but I think it would have been much closer. So that's for sure. And for me, I think it's a great start for the league, but I suspect things are going to get a lot more challenging, especially with a few of my future opponents that I've played a lot of games against. We have a guy in our group who plays a really mean Tyranid army, and we also have a guy who plays Iron Hands, which, you know, he's bringing those new Desolator Marines, those ones with the weird-looking missile launchers that everyone hates. Those ones, they're pretty good, and they have a lot of good indirect fire, so I'm thinking that they might actually be a very big problem. So he just recently bought those, and apparently they're doing very well in certain metas, and I know they're going to be good against my army. So I'm kind of secretly hoping I don't play against them. I know that sounds kind of weird to say, you know, because I'm usually up for a challenge, but, you know, anything with heavy indirect fire, I really don't like playing against. Obviously, you know, squishy space elves really don't like that anyway, so you know, I do have some challenging games ahead of me, potentially. I know that it's not for sure that I'm going to play that guy, but I am going to play Imperial Guard, and I believe he has some mortars in his list. I may not be, you know, 100% on that, but I think he does. So that's going to be another challenge that I have to overcome later this week, or, well, really next week now. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed the battle report, kind of. You know, I know that my battle reports aren't live or anything like that, but to be honest with you, I prefer doing it this way just because I think it's more tactical. You know, you can see over the board, you can see clearly what each unit is doing, and I have more time to explain why I'm making the moves and stuff like that in hindsight. That, and also the fact that, you know, my group doesn't really want to be on YouTube at all. So, you know, makes perfect sense. You know, a lot of people respect and really value their privacy, and I also respect that. So, all right, everybody, once again, that's going to be it. Thank you so much to everybody who has supported the channel through Patreon or through PayPal. I really appreciate your assistance, and making this channel better is something that I aim to do. So thank you so much for all your help. For those of you who do want to support the channel, I will leave the Patreon and PayPal links in my description. And again, thank you once again. All right, everybody, have a good one. See you later. And if you guys have any more video suggestions, I'm going to be covering more 10th edition reviews and stuff like that within the coming weeks. But if you want to see anything else, let me know, and I will go ahead and try to make a video on it. All right, peace out, everybody. See you next time.